Hi.
Hey out there.
Hello.
Hey Dan.
Hey Dan.
We're the Dans.
Yeah, we're the Dans. I'm Dan Perkle.
Dan Solzberg.
And we are both design researchers and project leads here at IDEO, and we're really excited to be here.
Definitely.
Hearing from you all, talking to you all.
We've been really excited talking with the whole IDEO team, watching how the course has been developing, and we hope you guys are here today with some interesting things to talk about. We love what we do, so we love talking about it.
Yeah, so we're going to get started in a few minutes. We're going to wait for some more people to pop on the chat. A couple things to let you know about. In your view, you should have a window that looks something like this. I'm not sure if it's, yeah, on the left, on the right side, you'll have this column. And then on your main window, you'll have this guy with a little icon that looks kind of like that, which if you click on it is one of those, and you should see a Q&A box like that. And if you click on that, then you'll be able to post questions or see questions that are being posted.
And I think the format is, if you want to ask a question or just make a comment as the discussion's unfolding, use the Q&A tab or button for both of those.
Yeah. And as you ask questions, one of the things that we would love to know is your name, what industry you're working in, and what's the challenge that you're facing. Like, what are you working on?
Yeah.
And that'll help set the context for us, but also for everybody else out there. And it'll help us frame our answers, because one of the great things about what we get to do is we get to work in multiple industries and work on lots of different kinds of challenges, and often research fits the context of a challenge.
Yeah, it's amazing. In the past year, I've been working on workspace design. I'm working on redesigning recruitment for pediatric clinical trials. I worked on deep brain stimulation and the patient experience around having implants in your brain that help control motion disorders.
Yep.
How about you? What have you been up to?
No deep brain stimulation. I mean, I've worked on my own brain has been stimulated. I've been working in financial services, thinking about all kinds of new products in the financial services space. Done work with television and media, with software, education. So there's been a lot of stuff in the past couple of years. I see a few more people who've joined, which is great, and we even have first introduction up on the screen
from Anya. Hi, Anya.
Hope we're pronouncing your name right. Is it Anya
or Ina? Ina. So Ina, I don't know. We'll test this out. We'll see how interactive this is. Yep. Where are you from, Ina? And other folks who are listening in, if you guys want to just type in your name and what you do and where you're from, then we'll have a sense of who's in the conversation. Yeah,
and while you're doing that, we'll introduce ourselves again. I'm Dan Perkle.
I'm Dan Solzberg.
We're both design researchers here at IDEO and have been involved in lots of kinds of projects. We are broadcasting this live from the shop in our San Francisco studio, one of our 2 locations in Silicon Valley, and we're excited to be here. It says magic on the back wall.
Yeah, a lot of magic happens here.
Magic does happen, I guess.
I guess that's one of the things to say about doing insights work here at IDEO is we're always doing insights work in order to make something. Or create something. You know, it could be a thing like that, or it could be a service, it could be an experience, it could be a space, it could be a set of interactions like what you guys will be having with us today and what you've been having throughout the course. So I think to keep in mind that all the insights work leads directly into solving some kind of problem in a tangible way. And I know there's another course coming up as well that kind of pursues further along that arc.
Yep. And thanks, Ina, for responding so quickly. So now we know how to pronounce your name, which is awesome.
Ina.
Cool. Welcome.
Who else is out there?
Anybody else wanna volunteer their want to volunteer themselves or show us who's there?
So I'll start in the spirit of interviewing and getting to know people deeply and that kind of thing. I'll share with you guys something I'm struggling with right now as we do this first broadcast, which is learning how to look here at the camera so that it feels like I'm talking to you, which I am, However, you'll probably see me a lot looking up here because that's where your questions are appearing. And that's also where I can see my own face, which is distracting. So let's see how well I do. Hopefully you'll know that I'm trying to look at you.
Yeah, and it's pretty interesting when you kind of bringing that up. One of the things that I'm really passionate about is thinking about insights that kind of come from observations or interviews or other experiences where you aren't always in a face-to-face, like co-located environment. So like Dan and I can talk here and we can have a great conversation, but I've done a lot of research where I've had to chat with people over instant messenger or over calls like this and trying to figure out how the right way to communicate or be kind of authentic or present in different media is actually really, really important. So that would be, so I think us figuring it out for this interface is something that we have to learn on the fly all the time.
Definitely. Yeah.
So, we had a hey there from Diego.
Hey, Diego.
Diego, where are you from? What industry do you work in? What are you working on? Oh, there we go. Lima, awesome.
Peru. Welcome.
Digital project management. Fantastic.
Yeah, so you've got lots of experience struggling with digital platforms, I'm sure.
I'm guessing.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So
great. Thanks for joining. Well, we've got
10 people.
Yeah, we've been bantering on. We had 10 people. Why don't we jump in? I'll do if you haven't figured it out yet, for those of you who are not on, you get a window that looks something kind of like this, and there's like these icons up there, and if you want to join the chat, you click on one of those, get your boxes. Then in your boxes, there'll be the Q&A box, and it should open up the stream. And who knows if Q&A is mirrored or not in this thing? Another good moment of And so why don't we? If any questions about that, we'll find a way. Maybe we can also respond to what's going on Twitter. So on the Twitter feed, we have the Insights for Innovation hashtag, and there's obviously at IDEO. Both of those things, I'm guessing all of you are quite familiar with at this point. But if you're not, there you go.
And welcome Melinda from Boston, formerly from Russia and then Toronto. Nice to have you here. Ina from Russia as well, it sounds like. So we got some questions ahead of time that people had posed. And while you guys are thinking about what you'd like to talk about, we thought we'd just get the conversation rolling. And the first thing that people were curious about was just talking about something that's very much upfront in the design process, which is figuring out what the challenge is. What is it that you're actually doing all of this to solve, to accomplish, to explore? So we talk about framing the challenge.
Yeah, framing a challenge. I mean, maybe it's actually one of the most important things that actually happens. Often the success of a project often happens in the first week when you're just framing it and you're figuring out what is it that this project needs to be about.
Right.
So we know that is a challenge. It's a challenge. We go through this every single project on our internal teams and with our clients. It's like, how do you frame a challenge?
Right.
So what do you think, Dan? How do you go about doing that?
Well, I mean, I think it's always nice to sort of talk about spectrums. Most things in design kind of range along a spectrum, and so I think framing a challenge, you could think about being at one end of the spectrum where you have a challenge like make things better. That's pretty broad. That's really hard to design to, right? Where do you start?
Yeah.
But then you might have a challenge that's like here's an alligator clip. It might be something like, improve the experience of squeezing this alligator clip into these two little cylinders.
Yep.
And I mean, I don't know. How far are you going to go with that?
Yeah. So challenges can be very broad and they can be very narrow. And those are all valid challenges, certainly. We face, every business often has a question like, what's the future of X? And the future of X is the thing that you're trying to work towards. So completely understand that. And there are product design challenges that are narrow but incredibly important. So really understanding, I think, where your thinking is on a spectrum from broad to narrow to start with is good. We find it's really important to make sure the challenge can be fairly generative. Like, there's going to be, like, you don't overly constrain it from the beginning, but you don't want to start somewhere where there's a complete lack of constraints. And so that word constraint becomes perhaps one of the most important words when thinking about a challenge. People often like to think that creativity is this unbound, unconstrained, kind of heroic endeavor, but really, like, there's no such thing as creativity without constraints.
Absolutely.
And certainly there's no pragmatic challenge that can be solved if there are no constraints.
Yeah.
So framing a challenge really is about finding out finding out which are the constraints that really matter, and which are the constraints can you start to peel away from.
Yeah.
And you don't have to get this right at the beginning. So after a few weeks, you might realize, you've been operating under a certain constraint about maybe it's a key metric in your business that's acting as a constraint. You might realize a few weeks in that, hey, we can start to change that constraint. And, and the challenge always evolves. So that's good.
Yeah. So one of the ways I think about this is levels of zoom, right? So if you zoom way out, any challenge becomes really big, really broad like that, make this a better place. But if you zoom way in, then you might be at improve this feature, improve this particular interaction. And I always think of the challenge that a client poses as a hypothesis that's coming from their point of view, from their business, from where they see their market going, where, sort of where they imagine they could do more with what they do. And I'm kind of a contrarian. So I guess I would say I often imagine that their hypothesis is somehow mistaken, misguided, wrong is how I might think about it, at first. And so for me, framing the challenge is about figuring out, how do I test that hypothesis? How do I figure out, first, where's it coming from? Which involves a lot of deep conversations with people in that organization, looking into that organization. And then also looking at where that challenge exists in the world and figuring out what are the interesting pieces of this to take on, and how do we parse it? So we were talking earlier about a project that I did a couple years ago where we were asked to look at the future of mobile communication 15 years ahead of time. And
that's easy.
Yeah, we were like, sure, we can do that. And we watched a bunch of science fiction movies, and we were like, oh, it looks like this, right? So what we did to try to kind of break that big universe down a little bit and make it something we could actually think about as designers was we asked ourselves a series of questions. So, a lot of our work as design researchers is really all about asking questions and not taking things at face value. So we said, all right, well, mobile communications, where does that happen in the world? Well, it happens in different contexts. Okay, how would we group or bucket those contexts so that we can think about them? So we thought about work. Work is a kind of specific zone for a lot of our experiences. We thought about social and relationships and recreation. And then we thought about families, because the family unit, sort of like work, it's like you have your work life, you have your family life. And so you can see how we started sort of unthreading that giant question of mobile. And at least it gave us a framework that we could start to break things down and start to box things in. And then again, like if you find you're zooming way in, there it is, and you're boxing things into the point where
you're out of focus because you're so
exactly right. You can't see it anymore.
There you go. So we have a first question, or maybe I don't know if it's the first question. We have a question from Hamdor, which is. Yeah. So the question is it necessary to stretch on both edges to identify specific people and behavior for every lens I choose? So I'm going to assume, Dan's grabbing a drawing. I'm going to assume we're referring to thinking about extremes and getting inspiration from the extremes. It's a great lesson up there about that you've been through already. So is it necessary to stretch on both edges? So I have a thought about this. I'll start off with one of the things I love about the question, which reflects that what you've gotten out of the course already, is that you always want to have multiple lenses that you're choosing, which I actually really like. I think people often hear design for extremes, and they do a great job with this, which is like, here's one dimension, but of course people are really complicated, right? And so, you can't even reduce people probably down to 10 of these, but at least you have more than one, which is great. So yes, love it that we're thinking about multiple lenses already. Do you need to always stretch on both edges? I mean, I kind of see always as like a signal that probably the answer is no. I think it's partly like a good reason and a pragmatic reason. The pragmatic reason might be time, but I also feel like the most important thing is to have multiple points of comparison. So if you find that, like, maybe this is the same drawing you're doing.
We'll see.
And I'll do it a little messier because I'm looking at Dan's drawings, so they're always cleaner than mine. But let's say you have like multiple lenses. They're all going in different directions. This is kind of 3D space, but not really. You may be okay with picking like a point there, and a point there. At least for early in the research, or at least some point where you're like trying to compare these points. I would imagine that there's always going to be a time when along any one dimension, you're going to want to have comparison points along that dimension. So never just going to one or the other. But I do think that, it would make sense to have multiple points of comparison on several dimensions on every one.
Right.
I'm not sure how much that matters. And often it's just determined by, what's the scope of the project and where you can get inspiration from and who's out there. I
think it's worth saying too, sort of where extremes come from.
Yep.
So, if we're asked to design something in here, which is sort of for a target customer base, let's say, I don't know, tweens that I don't know anything about tweens.
Yeah.
What do tweens do? They chat with each other, right? So tweens and digital social networking platforms, right? So, our client probably wants to really capture a big piece of that audience. Yeah. That's great. And we may end up really designing something that is appealing and is really for those people. But the thing is to understand what can be new for a set of people who are already in a domain, who are already using a set of tools or products. It's really helpful to look at just, as an example, like who's not using any of that stuff at all? Who hates that stuff? Who's the person who's got a quill pen and is writing on parchment and sending a letter with a stamp? Like, what's that about, right? There must be something there. And then looking at the person who's hacked together their own platform, or they're doing something novel with one of the existing platforms. And the thing is, if you were to just look at either of those, it's very hard to triangulate. Yeah. So, design research is really about finding multiple perspectives on something, and multiple perspectives that are not necessarily your own perspective. And then it's about figuring out across all those, what are the patterns of difference? What are the overlaps?
Yep.
And if you think about that triangle, if you only take 1 point, it's no longer a triangle. And if you only take 2 points, it's just a line. So I think that's similar to what Dan was saying.
Yeah, absolutely. So let us know if that answers the question, or if you want us to dig in deeper, Hamdor, we would be happy to. We can keep going on this probably forever.
Yeah, it's true.
But there are more questions coming up.
Yeah. And please ask questions, type them in. It's we're excited to see what you guys want to know about.
Yeah, and if a couple more people have joined, remember you can ask questions by clicking on the little guy with the top right, and you get little icons, and you can hit the Q&A bubble, and then in the Q&A bubble you can start asking questions, and we are actively monitoring it.
So in the spirit of prototyping, that's much better than the way we did it last time, because now we're doing it almost like a real interaction.
Almost.
Look at us go.
We're almost interacting.
Yeah.
It's good.
So while
we're interacting with each other through the screen.
Yeah. While we're waiting for another question,
I think we have another question.
Do we have another question?
Yeah.
Let's see.
Maybe not.
Where?
Yeah. So the question is from Ina, and Ina asks, how do you determine the right insight or / good idea in the list of good insights after going through information interviews? Ooh, that's a great question. That is a great question.
So actually, I'm dealing with this right now. I'm doing this very complex systems project where we're trying to help increase enrollment in pediatric clinical trials, which, if you know anything about that, or even if you don't, it's just a hairball of a challenge.
It's a hairball.
It is. Yeah. And we've done a bunch of research just to even understand what that ecosystem is and who the players are. And as we're researching, we come up with we see a lot of opportunity areas. So I think the first answer to this is, as you go, you're basically, you and your team, if you have a team, and client, if you have a client, you're basically filtering a lot of incoming information, data points, personal experiences, and you need to be processing them as you go. And as a designer, processing that incoming information is all about saying, what are the opportunities here? Where are there places where things can be improved, where things can be made a better experience, where we can solve unsolved problems? And so if you have a good practice around filtering and digesting and, what we really call synthesizing that incoming information as you go, right? So not going out and doing like 4 weeks of interviews and then coming back and saying, all right, what's it all mean? But really, as you go, saying, what are we learning? What do we think is interesting? What's raising questions? And that generates opportunity areas. You know, you see that people are struggling with something and you say, how might we make that better? And then that immediately makes you start thinking, well, we might make it better like this, or we might do this. We might build something like this. We might create a tool. Maybe there's a better space for that to take place in. And so you're building a repository of ideas that respond, you know, that correlate with what you're seeing and learning in the field. And so you're already starting to synthesize, like we talk a lot about diverging and converging. So as you go out and do research, you're kind of diverging, you're learning a lot. And as you do that ongoing synthesis process, you're converging your own thinking and creating, you know, creating like some guidance for yourself based on what you're learning.
Yeah, so this is a great question. Every project has this challenge, and I've been thinking about a few keywords that come to mind when I think about this question. So here's 4 words. They'll sort of answer the question, and we'll have to say more maybe. But one is that I think the insights that continue to stick with you or with your team. So on the first pass, you might say, hey, this is the best thing I heard. This is so interesting and so provocative. Well, one, does your whole team kind of agree with that, or do you all think that? And like the next day and the day after, does that remain sticky, or does that kind of like fall by the wayside a bit? So things that stick with you and your team, there's probably a good reason for that. So that's one thought. Another thing, I think, insights that end up being very generative, I think, is really important, especially. I mean, actually, I think always that's true. So, but when I say kind of generative, I mean, doesn't the insight right away like lead you to start drawing things or thinking about new things or making your brain like jump around, like
to go, I want to address that.
I want to talk about that, and then I want to talk about the thing that reminds me of that. If that's starting to happen, it's like, ooh, that seems to be really important. Let's see, another one, provocative. This is kind of like a wild card. Sometimes your goal isn't to be too provocative, and sometimes your goal is to be, and it kind of really depends on the project. But I found that if an insight is provocative, or it helps you think about something in a new way, or if the person who you need, the audience for that insight, you're like, they really need to be provoked or prodded a little bit, then think about this as like a filter or a sort order, I guess. Yeah. And then finally, I think you saw this in one of the courses, but insights that are actionable. Now that's tricky because you don't really know what's actionable. Like you don't want to jump. Like what can easily happen is you'll look at something and just say that's not actionable. It's very easy to think that too early. So you don't really know what's going to be actionable right away. But certainly if something seems actionable right away, and maybe that goes along with generative, then I would think about that as a criteria for determining the kind of right insights. I don't know.
Well, I think a lot. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this is really about how you articulate insights, and the process of articulating them can actually also help you figure out which ones are going to be productive, which ones might be too broad, which ones, you know, or can I take that and frame that in a way that's a bit more generative? So I play a game with my teams, which is to basically say, sort of at the end of, you know, maybe a day of research, all right, if you ran into the client in the elevator and on the way down they said, project's over, canceled, just tell me what I need to know from what you've done so far. Everyone on my team to have an answer for that, just sort of at any point in the project. You know, so what were the 3 things? You know, we went out today, we talked to 2 people, we talked to 5 people, you know, whatever it is. What are 3 things that you would just tell that client, hey, you know what? Oh yeah, I think that this would be really great for you to be thinking about. It's a great idea. You know, I'm going to start doing that. It works really well. Yeah. That's brilliant. Yeah. It's fast too. And I think that's another thing I would say is you can get really stuck in all the rich information and experiences that you have when you do field research. And part of, you know, design work happens pretty fast. Like it's a pretty fast arc. And so I think part of, you know, I would broaden your question a little to say, we're sort of talking about good design practice around insights. And so I think part of it is realizing how you need to pace it and how fast you need to kind of turn it into something that does become generative and actionable.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Hopefully that gets you thinking, Ina, and if you want to follow up, please do.
So it looks like the next question is about presenting insights back to clients, which is great. We've both done some interesting things around that. I don't know if you have a story you'd want to tell.
Yeah, I mean, so this is a tricky question, because I think this really, for me, depends. So here, the question is, what suggestions would you have for presenting insights back to clients? And there's actually another question from Melinda also about when do you include your clients? And I think those questions are highly related, because the answer to the one sort of implies an answer to the second. But for me, it often depends on the relationship with clients. We want to try to walk a fine line between giving clients things to think about throughout. Like we don't want to go, like in our work, I'll speak for myself and a lot of designers I work with. We don't want to have a model where we go away and churn on some insights and have some great reveal at the end. They're like, here's all the insights. That fails for a number of reasons. But one of the most important is that we don't get any collaboration from the client in generating these insights. And without that, then there's no co-ownership of the ideas or where you take them, or even understanding of what the insights are, because insights are never just things on a piece of paper. They're kind of like shared experiences with clients.
Yeah, so that's a good point.
So including like, how do you keep the clients engaged throughout the process? Very important. I think it's very important to, when you actually do share insights, there's a lot of ways of doing it. For example, recently I was in a project where our clients, they were really big readers, which is not always the case. Like these guys, you know, they were all about, how do we want this on paper, we want it to be printable, we are gonna sit and we are gonna read this stuff. And given clients who really wanted to read the stuff, like we wrote and we fueled a lot of workshops by presenting stuff on paper that they could read ahead of time. Well, that doesn't always happen.
You're making such a good point, which is that's a design process in and of itself.
Absolutely.
Right?
Designing insights, designing the presentation,
and designing how you're communicating with people. So part of it is figuring out who's your audience, figuring out, like you guys did, what they respond to. So please.
I was going to say, so another point I think from my perspective is, I think you want to tell stories. So insights, I think, always are presented better when you can have a rich story that goes along with it, whether it's a story of a field experience, or even if it ends up being some kind of chart, but the chart tells a rich story, we'll use that. So I would recommend being visual, and visual helps with things like memory. Like you want memorable insights. I mean, I think when you're in the field, thinking about what's an iconic image of this situation, of this person or this context, so part of it is collecting good artifacts, and photography, it's kind of one of the simplest ways to really capture something. But beyond just documenting, and think to, as an artist, as a photographer, how would I communicate the essence of this to somebody and bring those images back? And I'll just share something a photography teacher told me, because it's super helpful. Shoot a ton, right? When you're taking pictures, don't try to just take the perfect picture, but take a ton of pictures. Get the perfect one, but take a ton around it. And that way you'll have that material, right? And then you have those colors on your palette. Yeah, and I don't think this contradicts what you're saying, but I think it adds another angle. Like these don't have to be beautiful pieces of work to represent this. I mean, often it helps when you can do something beautiful, but I was in a project recently where one of the core insights that we had to remind our clients came from a little grainy image that a participant actually took herself in her office. And when you look at it, it's like, you look at this image and it's like these two monitors, they're fuzzy, like there's like, all you get is this representation, like paper on walls and things like that. And it's a terrible photograph. Usually at one of our presentations, you would never put that photograph front and center, but that's what we chose to do, because the insight that it depicted, which was the fact that, this woman who worked in, she was selling air compressors in some Rust Belt state. She had this like gritty office and there was lots of stuff, but even on this really gritty office in the Rust Belt, she had these two huge flat panel displays helping her sell. And it was kind of like, it didn't matter that the picture was so grainy and not exciting, but it was like those two things, two big flat panels in an office that looks nothing like the stereotypical Google or Facebook office of the world. And it was just really like, it was a really compelling image. And that one image stuck with the team, it stuck with the client. And it was not a good photograph in that sense, but it was incredibly provocative.
Well, Dan's doing a really good clarification of what I said, because it's true. It's not necessarily about beautiful, but it is about sort of iconic or something that really brings a point home. And iconic. I mean, you could almost say the image you're describing is an insight in and of itself, right?
Absolutely.
It's emblematic. So, and then sometimes it's really about creating an experience for your clients. So I'll tell a quick story about a project I did a few years ago where we were dealing with people who were caretaking either professionally or for family members. They were caretaking for people who were really quite ill. So caretaking for these folks was becoming, either it was their full-time professional job or it was something that was kind of becoming that because they were caring for a family member. And the team and I were out in the field, and we walked out of someone's house, and we were standing there a couple doors down after we walked away, and we just looked at each other. And we had a client team of about 30, so there was no way we could get everyone into that living room to have that experience we had just had. But we just looked at each other and we were like, we were just floored, right? Because it was so emotional. It was kind of devastating what these people were really doing in their lives. And so we said, well, we can't bring our clients into that living room, but let's figure out a way to bring that living room to our clients. And so what we ended up doing, because we just felt like this was so powerful, and we want our clients to be in the feeling that we're in right now. So what we did was we, after we did our research, we went back and we asked a couple people who were really articulate and sort of really able to convey that emotional situation. And we had them come in to a big client workshop where we had this team of 30, and we had them do a panel discussion and just facilitated a conversation about the experience of being a caretaker. And what was just so beautiful about this was the two people eventually stopped talking to me, and because I was facilitating them, and they just started talking to each other. And at one point they reached, here, let's see your hand. They did this. And they just started talking to each other, and like literally broke down because they connected around this, this incredible, rich and difficult experience they were having. And everybody in the room was just right there. And then the rest of the day, as we were designing together, we were all just, sort of really standing in that place. So, I think it takes a lot of different forms.
Great. Yeah. Cool. Let's also take a look at our Twitter feed here. We some questions are starting to come in. So Camilla asked a question. How much time do you allot for the research phase in the project? Dan.
Wow. Thanks for passing that along to me.
How much time?
Well, it depends, right? So it depends on the framing of the challenge. It depends on the complexity of the domain or the ecosystem or the product or the things around that product or service. It depends on literally the scope of the project. So if you have a project that's scoped for 12 weeks and you have a set of things that you're tasked with getting to at the end, kind of figuring out how much is enough, how much is too much, how much is too little. It's funny, like I'm realizing the answers to so many of these things are, it depends.
Sure.
And, part of it is that we're talking to you as consultants. So we're doing this work for someone who comes to us and they have a challenge in mind and they have a set of outputs in mind. And even though there's a lot of discovery that happens together and shaping that along the way, there are constraints. So you design it within those constraints. I think too, a thing that we're starting to do a lot at IDEO is not really thinking about the research phase necessarily, but thinking about research as one tool in the design team's toolkit. And how do you inform the design process along the way, the whole way through from start to finish?
Just to kind of build on that. I mean, we've started in our own internally talking about like research net as much as we can, not really thinking about it as a phase, but really as it's a constant journey of discovery. It's a constant journey of inspiration, insight, sometimes analysis, sometimes feedback.
Right.
That doesn't happen always in one particular chunk. So in a project I was recently on, we did have we actually did a bunch of design before we did research, and then we did some research, and then we came back and worked with it, and we realized that there were things that we didn't know, and we went back out and talked to some more people, and then we did that loop a couple times, and we even did research in the very last week and produced a little insight bucket the day before one of the final presentations.
Nice.
And it didn't have to be all packaged and polished. It had to be this idea that we are continually learning, and that's even when we're no longer working on the project in the consulting capacity, and this might apply to you more who are not consultants but working in companies. Like it's kind of never over in that sense. You have to just sort of decide when it's over for you.
Yeah, but you know, you're probably also craving a more tangible answer. So I
3 days.
Yeah, great. That's it. Everybody, 3 days.
Sorry.
You threw me for a loop there.
No problem. Go for
it. I would say think about, to inform your challenge, like we were talking about it at the beginning about extremes. So think about your challenge. Do a jam with your team or on your own if you're working on your own, and just say what's the minimum I can do to inform this challenge and to like broaden it or narrow it, to inspire it from different directions, to look at the edges. You know, is that what I need to see 8 people and I need to go to 2 different places? Great. How can I get that done? You know, 2 a day if they're in the same city gives me time to think in between.
Yeah.
So you just sort of, it's sort of like you do as much as is necessary.
I think that's right.
Within the scope of what you've got.
Yep. Yeah. That's absolutely right.
Yeah. So we would, oh, sorry.
No, hopefully that answers that question, unless you want to.
Yeah. I mean, like any of these questions, we could go on and on with them. It's, you know, this is a very deep and rich art that we're all engaged in. So we would love to hear any questions you guys have about bringing some of the skills that you've been learning through the course back into your organization, back to your team, or to your own work.
Yeah. And so you know, one of the things that came up earlier, we touched on it, but there was that question, the second question from Melinda about how often and when, and do you include clients in the process?
Yeah.
So do you want to start?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. That's something we're figuring out right now on the project that my team is doing. So we've got a team that wants to understand how we're working. Their desire is to be really engaged, but their ability to do it is somewhat limited. They're a bit dispersed, and so it's not like there's a kind of core team there that we can just hook into anytime. Yeah. So what we've done from the outset of the project is really just say, okay, with this particular team, we need to design periodic, very intentional touch points where we've done enough so that they feel satisfied that, oh yeah, okay, you guys are really on the road to something, but we haven't gone so far that there's no way to kind of help them experience how we got there. Yeah. So, you know, I think it depends. This will be we should make a Post-it to hold up and just say it depends.
Should have it depends.
Yeah, make the depends Post-it. Yeah, it depends on your client's appetite. It depends on how you want them engaged, how they want to be engaged.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've been on projects where it's ranged between, having clients embedded in our project space for weeks. That was great in some ways, challenging in others.
Yeah,
I've had projects where they're like, oh, we're really confident in you guys. Like let's schedule a meeting 3 weeks out. And on the one hand, that sounds great, and then you realize a week later, you're like, no, we need to make sure that we're all involved here. Right. And again, it's that point. I guess this really would apply to people who are even not consultants technically, but I would imagine that any researcher in any organization always has somebody who's more or less the client, whether that's a product team, that's a marketing team, that's the boss, that's your colleague, even like another researcher. So just try to understand what kind of involvement does that person need to carry the research forward in the direction that it's supposed to go. Yeah. And the less touch points usually means less ownership and success I've seen, but that, it's probably not a hard and fast rule.
Well, I think what you're pointing to is something really critical to know about this work. It's very experiential.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of thing where really what you're doing is you're sort of changing your muscle memory around something. You're like changing what you believe to be true about something. And as a team, you're doing that together.
Yeah.
And in a way,
research boot camp.
I mean, you can't go back to a client and say, hey, I'm different now. I want you to be different too.
Right, too late.
So I think whenever possible, if if you realize that really what you're about with this work is creating some kind of change for people, if you can help your clients have that experience as well, then you're sort of all arriving at the same place together. Yeah, I mean, I think when you can do that, it's really beneficial to the work, and it's really exciting. And then sometimes your clients, they may be subject matter experts in something that's too complex for you to really, you know, get your hands completely around. So I think there are real benefits to the work too, but it is figuring out what's right for that particular situation. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have 10 minutes left. 10 minutes, yeah, more or less 10 minutes. We have another question from Ina. I also want to encourage anybody else out there who has not yet asked a question or wants to follow up on answers.
Yeah.
Start to throw them out there. Same on Twitter. So Ina, your question is, new to design thinking, the course. When will you suggest moving on to the next two stages, mindsets and empathy? Interesting. Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, I don't know if I would think of those as next stages per se. And I don't know if I'm contradicting the way the course is structured in saying that.
Don't contradict the course.
I think these are things you're developing as you go along. So maybe what it's about is figuring out, are we at the stage now to more tightly articulate some of these things? So, you know how we were talking earlier, right, about going out, doing observations, doing interviews, doing digital data collection, however it is that you're learning, informing and inspiring the work. And then sort of as you're going, synthesizing and...
I'm guessing that's what Mindset's about. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think as you start to feel like you're understanding something, here, so here's my notebook. So, you know, that's sort of nothing, but that's actually a really significant sketch of a way that we were understanding a bunch of conversations that we had. And that's going to translate directly into not necessarily a mindset, but some kind of framework. And I think that when you start to have something and you can articulate it, whether it's with a sketch or a model or a phrase or a picture or some combination of those, you want to capture it, right?
Absolutely.
So I think you don't want to necessarily feel like it's something you're waiting to do, but capture that stuff as it comes and then do an iterative process to make it more sticky, more actionable, more generative, more provocative, all those things that Dan pointed out.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'm maybe reading too much into the question here, so I apologize if I am, but it sounds like your question is also about if you are new to the process, not just like new in a particular research thing. So, let's say, you know, observation, interviewing, mindsets, and empathy, we're all these different stages. They really link together fast. So I wouldn't say you should hold yourself back at this point. If you feel new and you want to practice observing and interviewing more over the next, you know, whatever, because you feel like you're still new and still getting the hang of it, great. But certainly thinking about how to like narrow down to certain mindsets or behavioral archetypes, that's something you may want to practice sooner rather than later, because that is where you're going with all this. I'm guessing empathy is something that you're starting to like come to understand and build as a craft already. So you're probably already there.
You're developing that as you go.
Yeah, and you can always practice empathy, even if you're not doing research.
Yeah.
So
actually, I practiced empathy on the train this morning. I was watching the train conductor talk to. I was in the bicycle car, and things get a little combative in there a lot because there's not enough room for everybody.
Bike fights.
Yeah.
I love bike fights.
And so the
Bay Area is all about bike fights.
The bike train conductor had to come down on this guy pretty hard, and then he was trying to kind of patch things up, and he was like, "Oh, you know, what kind of bike is that?" And the guy was just sort of standing there and not really responding.
Yeah.
And so I was looking at this guy going, "Oh, you know, he's kind of like, he's being really unfriendly." And then finally he goes, "Yeah, I don't know that much about that bike. My dad passed away and he gave it to me."
Oh man.
You know, and so I was like, "Oh, okay, wow." Like, you know, my sort of empathy dial went way up, you know, because I didn't have the whole story. And so I think as you interview, as you observe, you're getting below the surface of things. And hopefully what that will do automatically is just open you up and let you feel like you understand the world from different people's perspectives.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough on the bike fight and the train fight.
Yeah.
Making the same thing.
Yeah.
But that does give you rich opportunity to practice empathetic thinking.
Totally.
Yeah. Anytime. I mean, it's funny. It's like one of those things where nobody likes to say it, but anytime you get a chance to actually witness some kind of conflict, there's a great moment to practice an empathetic moment. It's always ripe for empathy with anybody who's involved, including yourself as a spectator. So I was kind of joking about it, but it's serious. I mean, like, being able to see that.
Yeah, I mean, the opportunities to practice this work are everywhere.
We have another excellent question from Hamdor.
Yeah.
How much should we be objective during the empathy process?
I have a nice quick answer for this. What I think is, you already know what you think and believe. And so the reason for doing the work is not to reinforce or confirm what you already believe to be true, because you've already got that. So, you know, I think just sort of knowing what that is and being able to set it aside and go out and say, here's another perspective. And now you've got your perspective and you've got that second perspective. And then you do some more research and you've got that. And so now you've got a whole bunch of perspectives. And I think the objectivity comes from really looking at them all together. Yeah. What are the similarities? What are the differences? You know, that objectivity comes from understanding that there are multiple perspectives.
Yeah, I agree. And the word I like to use for me rather than objectivity is distance. So I think about, how do you, like, in a weird way, like in some ways, the only way to be empathetic to a certain degree, at least empathetic in a way that's going to be meaningful to design, is to actually counterintuitively to maintain distance and not like really be in the person's shoes. And usually the best way to actually do that is not just compare it to your own experience and to hold your experience as like a thing there, but to get to Dan's point, you're going to talk to a bunch of people or see a bunch of situations, and by using these different points out in the world as ways of applying distance to each other, then I think you're in a way having at least some measure of objectivity, probably the right kind of objectivity for this kind of process. Yeah. Hopefully that wasn't too abstract and there was a learning there. Hamdor, please ask again if you want to follow up. We have another Twitter question.
Yeah. So the question is, do you have insights that have been captured by us specifically that we're most proud of?
No, it depends.
Yeah, and we're not allowed to say it depends.
Yeah. No, it depends.
Let me think.
Insights most proud
It's
of.
funny. So I will answer the question, and I'll also say it's hard to pull an insight out of thin air because it's very contextual. It's, you know, about being immersed in the project and the world of the project. But I will tell you about one. Fairly early on in my IDEO career, I worked on a project for a Korean company, and our task was to help come up with new ideas for automobile lights and mirror systems. And so we researched a whole bunch around the driving experience, and we talked to people who love driving. And one of the extremes we wanted to look at was someone who hates driving. So we met a woman who lives in the Los Altos Hills, you know, kind of up in the mountains, and is basically a chauffeur for her kids and her kids' friends. And it gets foggy up there a lot. So she's driving through the fog. She's carting these kids around every day. They're, you know, going nuts in the minivan. And she really doesn't like driving. Now, our design team, you know, we're a bunch of designers. We're all kind of enthusiastic about cars, let's say. And, you know, people are like, yeah, the headlights, they're the personality of the car. They're the face of the car. You know, we have this kind of very designerly way of thinking about what headlights mean. So we went and interviewed this woman, and she was talking about driving through the fog every day. And, you know, we said, oh, you know, what would make that better for you? And she was like, well, you know, I know some cars have fog lights. I wish my car had fog lights. And her car did have fog lights. But the icon for a fog light in most cars, it kind of looks like this. It's a bunch of squiggly lines. And so this poor woman driving in the fog every day on these mountain roads with a car full of kids didn't know that she had a tool that could help address that situation.
It's amazing.
Yeah, and so I felt like that helped kind of recalibrate the design team a little, you know, because yeah, it's great to think about the personality of the car and the iconography of the headlight, but let's also think about helping that woman understand that she has fog lights. So for me, that was an interesting reframe.
Yeah, that's I guess now I feel on the hook for answering without, I don't know if I do, but that was a great question. I mean, that's a great answer, great insight. The one, several things came to mind right away. I was doing some work. We were trying to help redesign products and services for people who are thinking about retiring or as it turns out, perhaps not. So So one of the things that we had to do really early on, like, I guess our clients really had different views of retirement, and some really thought that one of their early insights, assumptions, or intuitions was that for many people, retirement was really like not a good thing. It was kind of a bad word.
Huh.
And we actually got some insights from plain old secondary desk research, where there was this great kind of very human-centered research done around showing that some people actually do get forced into retirement. It's not really a choice that's made.
Yeah.
They might get laid off when they're 55, and suddenly when they're 65, they're retired, or they don't even know they're retired, but they kind of are retired. So in a way, that was like an insight from desk research. But then where we took that is that, our client kind of jumped in that and said, yeah, we know that retirement is death. Retirement's a really tough experience. Nobody wants that.
It's a strong point of view.
But as it was a very strong point of view, what we actually learned was that there's people that we talked to, a lot of them actually, when they thought about either retirement or really more broadly speaking, just their future, they were actually incredibly hopeful. These were people who were hopeful and optimistic. They had even just gone through like the Great Recession, and there was a lot of hope, but it was really a hope with a great deal of uncertainty. So what I think had been thinking of, like, this idea of like retirement being this really horrible thing that might happen to some people. It was like, one, some people actually love being retired, which was great, but it was the combination of hope and uncertainty that kind of led us to a whole range of new ways of thinking about the challenge. Like we got new brainstorming questions that came out of that, new service ideas. So hopefully that's one small insight from one project. There are many more. We could have those over a virtual whiskey or beer or something. Right. In the future.
So we have a last question, and we wish we could do this all day because it's great. Fun. Yeah, it's really fun.
Great questions too.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, I will just make a meta comment that having these conversations and continuing the conversation amongst yourselves and other designers and other non-designers, that's a great way to kind of deepen your practice as well, just to really reflect on it.
Yeah, I mean, that stuff's never just stuck. It's not like, well, this is the end. Now we know it all. It's the conversation that keeps it going.
Right. So the last question we do have for today, though, how do you suggest keeping the innovation process fresh? I don't know, Dan, if you want to take a run at that.
How do you keep the process fresh? Yeah, I mean, I think, well, the one thing I would hope is that any process around like learning from people, it naturally would hopefully naturally like kind of update itself, because you just learn more and more about the world as a person and as a researcher or as a team, or the kind of tools that people are using or the spaces where they occupy or what's going on in the world changes. So hopefully it's kept fresh, because people change constantly. That's one thing. The other thing is what we certainly do on projects is people do get bored, and we'll say, hey, you know what, within the limits of what this project's about, within the scope, what do we want to learn how to do?
Right.
Where can we experiment? And experiment in a way that experiment with the process in a way that we know isn't like a big. We're not putting a huge risk. Like we're not taking all this trust that we've earned from whether internal trust or external trust. So there's always plenty of opportunities to experiment. And an example might be, if you're used to doing a series of projects where you go out and you meet people in their homes and you interview them for long periods of time, you could think, well, what would it be like to do these? I guess remote interviews. Right. If we wanted to make sure that we talk to folks all over the country, how would we do that? Let's just try it. What's the worst that can happen? Or if you're used to recruiting participants in a certain way, and maybe there's an approach where you're like, we need to talk to small business owners. Let's just drive 2 hours out of town and walk down the main strip of some small town and go walk in there and ask people for a minute at a time. And that will certainly keep things fresh, and it might even lead to better insights. So I think it's about being very, very intentional about your process. Your actual question raised questions about lingo, and I think intentionally questioning your lingo is another way you can keep it fresh, because what you'll realize is that the way you frame it kind of dictates often the way you pursue it. And if you choose a different word, then maybe suddenly new ideas open up to you. Maybe that's where you're going. Maybe that was your insight actually in framing the question that way. So
that's well put. Thanks,
Dan.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's a process that you're actually constantly designing as you do it. So I use the analogy of jazz a lot. So jazz is a form of music where there's a structure, but within the structure, there's a lot of improvisation. And that's what keeps jazz guys excited, about playing into their 80s, is the fact that the same song is never the same song twice.
Well, I mean, it's an art form built around improvisation, right?
Absolutely.
That's what jazz is.
So I think that's
research.
Right. And design.
Yeah,
so I
and
think I think understanding the room for improvisation is one way. And the other thing that comes to mind is just curiosity.
Yeah.
I think figuring out at the beginning of a design project, what am I curious about? And really using your participation in that process as an opportunity to deepen and enrich your own experience in the world. Because it's always different. Every time you go through one of these, it's always something different.
Yeah, and I think those two words, is the two ideas: improvisation, curiosity. Those should naturally feed each other.
Yeah.
In a very productive way. I love it.
Yeah.
Great.
Well.
Wow. We time has flown for us.
Yeah.
I think we're about out of time.
Thank you so much for joining IDEO today.
We would love to know if there was anything in particular that you found helpful about what we told you, about the process, about anything. We would love to know.
Yeah.
You can tweet it out at IDEOU, the hashtag. What was the hashtag? Insights for Innovation was the hashtag. We would love to know what was useful. We would love for you to share, obviously, share out with others in the course, maybe others who would find that same tip useful. We're always open for direct feedback as well.
Sure.
So happy to hear.
Yeah.
I'm on Twitter.
So I'm on Twitter.
Yeah. Right.
Yep.
Damn.
So hit us up.
Yeah.
And have fun out there.
Yes.
Have fun designing. Have fun researching. And we'll talk to you later.
Stay curious. Bye. Like the way.